So industrial policy is a set of policies that a government uses to target specific industries, firms, or economic activities to meet certain economic or social goals. It is not necessarily just subsidies for research and development. It is much more aggressive of a tool than those classic support policies that one talks about.
In fact, China, the United States, Russia, and many European countries, through industrial policy over the years, have helped create giants in the global economy like Alibaba, Airbus, Volkswagen, General Electric, Huawei, and the list goes on. So in today's program, we ask, does government mess with market forces when it bolsters its own national industry?
Not all national champions are the same. Not all circumstances are the same. And we need to understand the full scope of why and when trying to play a more aggressive role in tinkering with how the economy works may work or not.
All right. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell me why you got interested in industrial policy?
I'm Ruchir Agarwal. I'm an economist. I'm on sabbatical from the IMF and currently visiting the Yale School of Management and Harvard Kennedy School. Why I got interested in industrial policy is for years I've worked in many different countries through the IMF and other engagements. And time again, an issue of what is the growth strategy is often central. Or always hiding somewhere in our conversation with the country authorities. And among them, imagine a dashboard, a leader having a dashboard with various levers one can pull. A very attractive portion of the dashboard is what would constitute industrial policy. And we do not really yet, as economists, have a very good way to think about the pros and cons of pulling those levers. And time and time again, certain patterns came up from a political economy perspective. And my motivation was to write down those intuitions from the country experiences, drawing on those lessons.
Great. Thanks, Ruchir. So what happened to industrial policy? I mean, this concept of designing policies to support or even bolster those industries that were driving the economy after World War II. Why did some countries choose to move away from that concept?
Yeah, so in many ways, this goes back to a classic debate in economic policy. What is the role of government? And how intrusive should the government be in private economic activity? On one end of the spectrum is the US classic United States model where you set the rules of the game. You can provide subsidies for research and development, which have large positive externalities, but you don't really go into the business of picking winners or picking national champions. Of course, after World War II, on the other end of the spectrum, you had the Soviet system, but somewhere in the middle were continental European countries like France, which had somewhere of a more intrusive approach where they did want to create national champions, and so there were more targeted subsidies. Over time, there has been a recognition, a gradual, slow recognition that kind of approach may not be as productive because it's very hard. It's hard to learn that it's not working, but over a period of a decade or two, you often see that years of pursuing such targeted subsidies have not worked. And in a way, the intellectual pendulum shifted in the 80s and 90s, much closer to the US corner.
Maybe let's step back one step here, because you mentioned, national champions or national winners. Mm-hmm. What are national champions or national winners, and why do we have them?
So there are two very closely related concepts, but different. One is the idea of picking winners. It doesn't have to be a champion, but suppose as a country you think you want to develop your own industry in a specific space. It could be some manufacturing sector. And you say, I want to pick winners to develop that kind of industry. Or you see a set of proposals and you say, I want to support this particular entity. It could be for good, legitimate reasons, or it could be for reasons where you're politically linked to that entity. The slightly different idea, but closely related, is creating national champions. So national champions are often large firms or group of firms in a given industry, which you treat almost as a jewel. In some cases, in some country cases, they're protected under, they have legal status. And these are, could be heavy industries. Often, traditionally, they were owned by the government, a majority stake, but it need not be. And the idea there is these entities may not just be doing a solely narrow economic, serving economic goals, but it could also serve social goals, for example, employment creation, and very importantly, national security goals. So to distinguish between the two, picking winners is a much broader thing, which could, typically can happen from a project selection type perspective. Whereas once you start talking about national champions, it brings this dimension of social or national security objectives.
All right. So now you had started to talk about why countries had started to shift away from that in the 80s. And, according to your research, at least what I've read is it had a lot to do with sort of, these market-oriented policies, moving toward market-oriented policies rather than the industrial policy. Walk us through that. How did that happen?
In a way, there are several things came together for that to happen. First is the reduced role of the state ownership in a lot of national companies. Second, countries, there was a move towards more open trade and a belief in a multilateral system. You no longer needed to duplicate certain services if you can basically rely on friendly trade partners for those critical inputs. And so in a world where you are getting integrated into the trade networks, you are in a world where you recognizing that state ownership, the role, a rethink on the role of the state. Those such forces come together to give you this move towards the market-oriented world. And I would say just one more thing. Another factor is recognition that there are a lot of merits in the system that the US was pursuing while still recognizing some of the social implications. But that combination of these three things, I would say, led to that shift.
Okay, so today, with a sort of a renewed interest in this industrial policy concept, have we come to doubt, do you think, our dependence on the markets to inform policy?
Yeah, so I think there are several things that have happened in the last decade. In many ways, when we look back at the 2010s with a bit more clarity, we'll realize there are many big changes that happen. One of the change is the rise of social media. And in a way, it became more easy for people to express their pain. And we got to learn about many different types of pain and a lot of social injustices around the world. And so there is a definitely renewed interest in what would be considered the role of government authorities to do something about that. Now, we're talking about economics. From an economics perspective, that effectively, in IMF speak or such equivalent organizations, they started talking about inclusive growth. What that essentially means is not just think about the growth of the economy totally, but also think about the composition of the growth, how different stratas or income levels or vulnerable households are prospering while the economy is growing. So that's kind of theme one, I would say, is a greater voice of the vulnerable and oppressed and a greater recognition by the policymakers to do something about that and shift towards what's called, let's call that broadly, inclusive growth.
Okay.
Yeah. The second thing that has happened is, I mean, of course, the pandemic is, for many of us, probably the worst shock we have seen in our lifetimes. And as you know, Bruce, I've done a lot of work on that. But
That's right.
but the key, one big recognition that came out of the pandemic is the global supply chains and global trading system. When things are tough or there are emergency situations, may not be as open. And it's very hard to get that trading system work for everybody. And we saw this from the experience of vaccine export bans and the difficulty that many developing countries faced in getting access to critical life-saving tools such as vaccines at the height of the pandemic. So that's development 2. And I very quickly added development 3. I think it can be said that the multilateral system now, what the folks at the IMF and in DC are calling fragmentation, is subject to tensions, is subject to a renewed rebalancing. And that is not simply about, two countries, say US versus China, but it's also a lot about many emerging markets, developing countries, which represent the majority of population in the world, wanting a seat at the table, and a recognition that maybe has to be a rethink on how countries cooperate at an international level. And this not only comes with challenges, but also fears. And there are large fears on relying on countries that may no longer be as friendly as before or may even be adversarial. And so that third part, I would say, is the geopolitical trend. So when you combine the 3 factors, the recognition of inclusion, 1. 2 is recognition that the trade system may not be open and resilient during shocks. And 3, the geopolitical tensions. We may come to a world where you rethink what does growth strategy mean for a given country. And that's where industrial policy is being looked at with totally new light.
Okay. So walk us through this growth strategy trilemma, as you describe it in your research.
Okay, so let's start, trilemma. What is a trilemma? Trilemma means basically there are 3 objectives a government or policymaker wants to pursue, but trying to do more of one means that they have to necessarily sacrifice some of the other 2, a little bit of the other 2. Yeah. And so before we talk about 3, let's talk about 2.
All right.
In the classic trade-off, what I would teach to the undergrads, and it's very simple for everybody to understand, is a trade-off between growth and risk. In the basic finance terms, if you invest in riskier assets, you can get higher returns, but that also means that at sometimes you can actually lose a lot of money. The same thing applies to growth strategy for a country. You can allow licensing regimes, which allows a lot of risky players to enter a given industry, for example, and they can take a lot of risks, and that can potentially deliver high growth, but it also could mean you have higher risk of financial stability risks, which is banks that are investing in these projects may lose a lot of money, or their fiscal stability risk, which means the government may need to then bail out some of these industries, right? So that's kind of the classic 101 trade-off, growth versus risk. Now, let's say my innovation in this thinking is you can think about a third objective now, which a lot of governments are starting to think more explicitly about, that is national champions, promoting national champions. So what does that mean? In a way, you may want to achieve or promote a national champion in a particular industry or particular set of firms because you think that gives you benefits from national security perspective or gives you some social benefits that you could not necessarily get from these classic 2 trade-off thinking. And so you may want to pursue this third objective, but now there's a trilemma, which is every time you try to go into selecting or promoting those national champions, it comes with a risk of either sacrificing some of your growth or sacrificing some of your financial or fiscal stability. But that's kind of the very elementary introduction to the trilemma.
So it's essentially a balancing act between growth and stability. And so is it the government's role to find that balance? And how might they go about doing that? I mean, governments answer to a lot of different constituents. How do they do that without compromising their own political survival?
Yeah, I love that question, because I wrote this piece exactly imagining the life of a leader and channeling a lot of the conversations I've had with government counterparts in basically every continent, a version of this conversation. And actually, it's, you know, if you're a creature that lives on Twitter, it's very easy to get into the mode of criticizing governments all the time. And there are many things to criticize. But I wanted to present the perspective where it's actually quite challenging for even a well-meaning leader to find that right balance. Okay, first point.
That's right.
Now, what is that? What is that challenge? In a way, you want to deliver jobs, you want to deliver better income, quality of life for your citizens. That's objective one, growth. You want to, in addition, you want to avoid crises. You want to avoid having to do large bailouts, which necessarily come with a lot of criticism, and rightly so, because often you have to bail out people who've made bad choices.
That's right.
But for national stability reasons, you have to bail them out. So you want to avoid cases of fraud or bad risk taking, or areas where you have to put taxpayers' money to put out a fire. So that's second. Yeah. And third, you may want to, now with the industrial policy, you may have a belief and a strong group of constituents that are pushing you to pursue your policies in a much more intrusive way than before through what I call national champion promotion policy. So that could be, let's build a semiconductor industry because your generals are quite worried, or folks in your foreign policy circles are worried of having too much reliance on a potential adversary. And so you say, okay, then you have to listen to those folks and kind of move a bit in that direction too. So that's kind of the balancing act, as I see today, many leaders are doing. And we can talk about why is it becoming even more attractive to move to that third pole, the national champions.
It's sort of like supporting industry that will also bolster your political strategy to some degree.
Yes, exactly. So I, my wife is a clinical psychologist, and I learned a lot from her. And so I channeled my years of learning from her here. So I talk about what I call growth anxiety and fear of instability. And in a way, one, fear is a very strong, let's talk about the second one first, which is fear of instability. The fear is a very strong motivator in all living beings, including humans. And also it's a big driver of voting behavior, right? Your constituency, as we've seen in recent years, there are newer ways to create fear and drive people to the polling station. So in many ways, there is a fear, genuine or otherwise, of becoming too reliant on others. So there is this concept called resilience. People are using in various ways. And one way they're using it is to say, we want to be resilient. Some of that is also coming under the guise, is guise for protectionist policies,
That's right.
So a lot of the voices that are advocating for in the national champion policies are coming through this, avoiding this fear of becoming dependent, and partly it's also coming from this group of voter base that really favor protectionist policies. And the growth anxiety is actually a very interesting another dimension, which is as a leader, you want to deliver growth, you want to deliver jobs, but you don't know how to do it right? If you set the rules of the game, you sit back and you wait for the private sector to deliver, you may not have a control over what the outcome is. So it may become too hard to resist to meddle and have a much more intrusive approach to ensure that you can deliver growth. So in some emerging markets, that manifests itself through the leaders calling upon people they trust, industrialists they trust, and kind of giving them preferential entry into industries where they feel they can deliver. Unfortunately, exposed, as sometimes we've learned, those bets don't work out, right? And so that may be driven much from this other psychological dimension, which is the growth anxiety. So that's kind of why you may want to move away from either stability or growth towards industrial policy. And these are the two psychological dimensions I discussed.
All right. So, at the end of the day, it's pretty subjective whether national champions are a good or a bad thing when you look at the various examples over the course of time and look at different countries. You have, some very prominent economists that are on both sides of the fence as to whether or not this is good or bad. How do we move forward with this? I mean, what is the best approach to supporting the economy while making sure people and businesses aren't being overly supported at the expense of others?
Let me say a couple of things there. First, I believe there is a legitimate question on what should the role of the state be when thinking about growth policy. And I think I don't want to be in the camp of people who, from an ideological perspective, already say industrial policy is bad. I do welcome the discussion that's happening on thinking about how can we create a more inclusive society without sacrificing growth. And that's, I think, an important question, first. Second, I do want, one goal of my piece is to still warn against just falling into the trap of thinking that this is just following industrial policy without necessarily thinking about really the context and understanding the likelihood that it's hard to make it work, right? I want to kind of create a warning that I want this trilemma to serve as a guide to policymakers to recognize that if they are moving towards that, to be very cognizant that it may very likely come with a cost, either in choosing champions that may prevent a higher growth than otherwise, or by potentially backing some champions or industries or projects that may lead to costs at the fiscal or financial level later. So that's kind of the second thing. The third thing I want to say is I really hope that there is more transparency and honesty in the discussion of why some governments are pursuing what they are calling industrial policy. For example, if you take the U.S. CHIPS Act and about $50 billion or so of subsidies they're providing there to manufacturing initiatives, if you look at the provisions that they've attached to conditions under which those subsidies can be received, there's a long list of provisions like requirement to not trade with China for 10 years or a requirement to have certain childcare policies. The firms must provide those. So what I want to avoid, I hope there is a more honest discussion, let's say, of not trying to use the surface, the nominally calling it industrial policy, but trying to just put in many of these additional policies to that. And worse, if it's protectionism under the guise of industrial policy. Ultimately, we want a world where we can have countries part of a vibrant trading system where they are reliant on each other. They allow good ideas to flourish, and the government can focus on designing more smart and direct ways to create inclusive societies rather than hiding behind this thing which is now being called industrial policy.
Indeed. all too often there are strings attached to these programs that look good on the surface, but I guess we all have to be wary, and more transparency would help indeed. Mm-hmm. Ruchir Agarwal, it's always such a great pleasure speaking with you. It's always interesting conversations, and I look forward to the next one.
I very much enjoy that. Thank you very much, Bruce.
So again, that was Ruchir Agarwal. He is currently on sabbatical from the IMF and at the Yale School of Management and the Harvard Kennedy School. You can read his article on industrial policy and the growth strategy trilemma at imf.org/FND. Look for more IMF podcasts at imf.org/podcasts or wherever you listen. And you can also follow us on Twitter at IMF_podcasts. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.